Okay, so I'm recording the third lecture video for the Master and his Emissary. This one is on the chapter, What Do the Two Hemispheres Do? So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit at the beginning about the two paper options. And then I'll review briefly what the two previous chapters were about, just briefly. Then I will talk some about the current chapter, including providing some potential option number one topic ideas based on this chapter and some potential option number two paper ideas based on the current chapter. So a little bit about paper option one. I changed the wording of this just a little bit with in the spirit of improving the clarity of the instructions here. So all I really did was I changed the order of some of the sentences in here so that the order in which things are presented and the instruction is as close to what I believe or will anticipate the order of topics will be covered in your paper if you choose paper option one. I also highlighted this right here because it's not something that I've emphasized verbally, that I recall at least, in previous recorded lectures on this topic. So it's always been here in the instructions, but I don't think I've actually kind of emphasized it verbally. So I wanted to make sure that I did. So I'll remind you for paper option one, choose a topic that both McGilchrist and Gazzaniga talk about in their books. You will start by describing, you start your paper by describing the topic as described by Gazzaniga. Then you will describe the topic from McGilchrist's perspective. And part of what you'll be describing regarding McGilchrist's perspective will be some of his opinions, some of his speculations about that topic. And then the next after that, you will kind of compare and contrast the similarities and differences of the two books regarding the topic. First part, talking about Gazzaniga. Second part, you'll be talking about McGilchrist, including his opinions / speculations. Then you will be comparing and contrasting the similarities and differences of the two books regarding the topic. And then finally, you will reflect on McGilchrist's perspective. Do you find it convincing, including the speculations? That's topic one. For option number two, this one, once again, it's about skeptical reading, a critical reading of articles and of the Master's Emissary. Skeptical reading. And I have highlighted another thing here. Now, this is something that I actually had said verbally in the past, but the little part right here was not officially part of the written instructions earlier, but I've decided to include it because it is important. And as I said, I had mentioned it verbally. So for paper option two, you will choose a topic, and then there'll be a claim in that topic in the Master and his Emissary. That claim will have at least two empirical citations supporting it. If you choose option number two, you'll basically specify the claim that was made, including the studies or articles that were cited in support of it. And the thing that I've added to the explicit instructions, I said this verbally previously, is that when you're saying what claim from the Master and his Emissary you will be evaluating, I do want you to include some context for why that claim was made in the book. So this will require you to say a little bit about kind of where the specific claim fits in with the big picture. I would say that paper option number one, the big picture is a important part of that paper topic. Paper option number two, you'll have to talk a little bit about the big picture, but really it will only be kind of in this beginning part where you're saying, here's the claim that was made, and it's relevant to kind of the overall story in the Master's Emissary for this reason. And then you'll start going into the heart of the paper, which is evaluating those two articles in some detail, determining whether the articles that were cited in support of the specific claim actually do support the claim that McGilchrist made. So that's it for reviewing the paper topics. For either of these, I am happy to talk about them, or you can email me if you have questions. So the parts of the book, reviewing some things, the introduction. This is short chapter in the book that was mainly about setting the stage, kind of talking about the big picture goals of the book. And those are, to remind you, characterize the functional differences of the left and right hemispheres of the brain, especially in terms of attention, the two attentional styles of the left and right hemispheres of the brain. Also characterizing the nature of the interaction of the left and right hemispheres. We got the corpus callosum, which is in the middle, and it allows information to be exchanged between the two hemispheres, but characterizing the nature of that information exchange, the nature of the interaction between the two hemispheres, is something that is important in the master and his emissary. And then finally, probably the biggest picture thing about the entire book is speculating. These are the very opinionated parts of the book on how the different functions of the two hemispheres and the nature of their interaction influences Western society. So those are the stage that you set in the introduction, and asymmetry in the brain. This is where he starts going into the research on the hemispheres in detail. So parts of this describe the interaction of the two hemispheres, like the nature of the information exchange between the two hemispheres. And then there's a lot of research in the book on the functional differences. A lot of research in this chapter on the functional differences between the two hemispheres. And then he starts in this chapter to characterize those functional differences in terms of attention. So what this means, you find a bunch of findings regarding the left hemisphere. And then you say, these findings all kind of fit this story or this narrative, the idea that the left hemisphere attends to the world in this way. And then he talks about all these findings regarding the right hemisphere from different research studies. And basically what he says is, these studies can be explained, these findings can be explained from the fact that the right hemisphere tends to attend to the world in this way. And so he's trying to characterize all these different findings about each hemisphere in terms of the different attentional styles of each hemisphere. And so I did want to talk a tiny bit about this, characterizing the functional differences in terms of attention, because I talked about this long quote last time, and it's one of the, it's a long quote from the book whose goal is to kind of connect these attentional differences between the two hemispheres to this. It's supposed to connect the two different attentional styles of the two hemispheres and trying to kind of explain why it's important in terms of the big picture. And a key element of this quote is the stuff at the beginning, this idea that we can never step in the same river twice. This is the idea I talked about a little last time, that if you stand in a river, the water is moving underneath your feet, and saying you're never standing in the same river twice is saying that at any given moment of time, there's certain water molecules which are touching your feet, and then they flow past you, and then a new set of water molecules is then touching your feet, and so it's always a new set of water molecules. It's never the same ones which are touching your feet at any given time. And so this is saying you're never really in the same river twice, because the water is always flowing in one direction. You're always being touched by new water molecules. I also talked about this in terms of William James, who conceived of consciousness as a stream of consciousness, like a flowing river or stream of consciousness. The idea there was that every experience that you have in the world changes the way your mind will work in future experiences. Everything that you do, you start to learn it and becomes part of your top-down knowledge system. And then that acquired knowledge influences the way that you will interact in the world. So every interaction, every experience you have now influences the nature of the experiences that you are going to have later on. So your mind is constantly evolving. It's constantly changing because experiences change the way it works each time. I wanted to say a little bit more about this idea of everything flows. A lot of those ideas I was talking about comes from Heraclitus, a Greek philosopher. And he's kind of known for this idea: everything flows, everything in nature flows. And I just wanted to give some more kind of concrete examples because it's a kind of deep, difficult philosophical idea. So here's a quote from, this is a link to a website if you want to read more, but I've just taken some of the highlights from that website. So a quote from Heraclitus, which kind of explains this idea that everything flows. Cold things tend to get hot. Hot things tend to get cool. Wet things tend to become dry. The parched things tend to become wet, or parched. The parched things moistens. Parched, I believe, just means dry. So dry things get wet, basically. And then it says here, Heraclitus concluded that nature is change. The fundamental way of nature is that things change. So I just wanted to give some more examples of this. Everything flows in nature, or everything changes in nature. Another example: the cells in bodies are constantly dying and being replaced. So I'm not a molecular biologist, so I don't know the exact amount of time, but my understanding is that over the course of a few years, every single cell in your body will die and then be replaced. You're obviously, you feel like the same person, but the cells that make you up, it's in a matter of some finite amount of time, several years, maybe we'll say a year or two, all of those cells will die and then they will be replaced. You're the same person, but all of the constituent cells, those die and they're replaced by new ones. So in this way, your body is kind of constantly changing. The cells that create you are constantly going away and new ones are coming in its place. It's kind of this continual thing which is happening that we're not even, consciously really aware of. It's one example of the flow of nature. I already mentioned in the previous, when I was explaining earlier, each experience of a mind changes the way that mind will experience things in the future. We learn, and that stuff is stored in our mind, and that those experiences will change the way we will experience things in the future. It's this kind of constantly evolving thing about our mind, constantly changing thing about the mind. Another example: all matter decays. Another way of saying this is kind of things die. And you could think about it in terms of old age. You gradually get gray hairs, or you gradually form wrinkles on your eyes, things like that. They're gradual but kind of constant changes which are occurring. And it's not just that live matter decays, not just things that are alive. They're actually, inanimate objects could be thought to decay as well. So here is an example. Well, I don't want to say it's necessarily decay, but it's definitely a change from one state to another, and it happens slowly. And this is an example here of oxidation, which happens on copper coins. The United States pennies, those are old pennies, used to be made from copper. I don't believe they're made from copper anymore. And when they were first minted, these coins were kind of bright red and pretty. But then gradually over the course of time, 50, maybe 100 years, because of oxidation, the color of the coin will change from this red to a darker brown color. And so oxidation, without going into the details, it's basically just the surface metal on the coin being exposed to elements in the air, particularly oxygen, but maybe some others as well, causes chemical reactions on the surface of the coin, which change the color of the coin. And it's this very gradual thing over time. It starts out red, and then it will be kind of a mixture of red and brown, and then eventually it will get brown at some point. And then at some point, the color will kind of just settle here. And this happens to basically anything which is made of copper. Once it's exposed to the elements in the air, it will just gradually change from this red state to the brown state. So everything flows, everything's changing. We're not always aware of it, but everything in nature apparently is changing. And to kind of connect this real briefly, I said this last time, but the reason this matters, McGilchrist talks about the fact that we have these two different attentional styles, the right hemisphere and the left. And they each kind of attend to the world in a different way. And it's the right hemisphere, according to McGilchrist, which is most in tune with kind of this flowing nature of things. It's able to actually kind of latch on to some of the the flowing nature of things. It's able to process things in a way which is most consistent with the flowing nature of things. Contrasting that with the left hemisphere, which he says that the way the left hemisphere works is that it doesn't see the flowing nature of things. What the left hemisphere does instead is it kind of artificially removes something from nature and creates kind of a representation of it. And that representation is fixed, it's static, it's unchanging, it's not moving. And so he says that these two different attentional styles are important because the right hemisphere is kind of giving like the true nature of the thing. But the true nature of the thing is actually very complicated. And if our minds were aware of all of the changes that were going on in nature constantly, we would be overwhelmed. Everything's changing all the time. It's just too much. So the idea that part of the purpose of the left hemisphere is to kind of, in a sense, simplify our understanding of the world. We don't need to be aware of the fact that everything is constantly changing. So instead, we have a tendency to categorize. Our brain says, the left hemisphere, I'm going to attend to those parts of the world which are fixed, which are static, which are not moving. So this is, in theory, according to McGilchrist, the reason why these two states, these two attentional styles of the hemispheres are important. So that was actually all review for the previous chapter, Symmetry in the Brain. Now I will talk about the new chapter, What Do the Hemispheres Do? So this chapter talks more about hemispheric differences in terms of cognitive function. And at the end, throughout this chapter especially, but at the end, throughout this chapter, but at the end especially, he characterizes the differences in terms of attention once again, which is what I was just talking about. Attention is definitely this big picture aspect of the book. All these functional differences he tries to explain in terms of these two different attentional styles of the left and right hemispheres. So we'll go into some of these now, and I'm going to do this by talking about these different paper option number one topics. I'll give you 3 examples. These are all based on things you can read in the chapter, What Do the Two Hemispheres Do? So one question or one topic would be the different types of attention and the neural substrates. So I actually mentioned this on the previous video on the Symmetry in the Brain chapter. This is something which is talked about a lot, especially in these early chapters of the book, the neural substrates of attention. I mentioned it in the previous video. I mentioned it again. You could do this topic. Another topic which is talked about in this chapter is hemi-neglect. This is the idea that some individuals with damage, particularly to the right hemisphere of the brain, will basically have trouble attending to or perceiving, or I guess you could say seeing, although that's not exactly correct. They can kind of see things, but they don't really pay attention to the left side of the world. People with right hemisphere damage will tend to miss or not pay attention to things in the left side of the world. That is hemi-neglect. That is a topic which is definitely talked about in both books. In the textbook, it's talked about a lot in chapter 7 on attention. And there's actually a lot of overlap. McGilchrist and Gazzaniga talk a lot about the same things about hemi-neglect, though there is some differences. One of the key differences is, I guess this is kind of a clue or a way of approaching this paper, is McGilchrist talks about another form of hemi-neglect, which is called asomatognosia. He doesn't call it hemi-neglect, but it's quite clearly, if you understand what hemi-neglect is, which is basically ignoring one part of the world, asomatognosia is definitely a variation of hemi-neglect. And this happens to be a topic that McGilchrist, asomatognosia, doesn't exactly touch on. So there are some definite similarities in the way the two authors approach hemi-neglect, but there's definitely at least one difference, but there's probably others, but this is just one difference. And then finally, the last example, face perception, prosopagnosia, and their neurological substrates or hemispheric differences. We talked about prosopagnosia the first time in chapter 4. Prosopagnosia, to remind you, is face blindness. There's more on the textbook in chapter 6. Actually, the stuff that we talked about in chapter 4, that was actually kind of taking some of the stuff from chapter 6 and bringing it to you early. By far, this part of the textbook which covers prosopagnosia in any detail at all is chapter 6. And it's also, of course, covered in the Master's Emissary. Both this topic of face perception / prosopagnosia is also relevant to this idea of holistic processing. Both our authors talk about holistic processing, and holistic processing is definitely part of the big picture attentional disposition of one of the hemispheres. According to McGilchrist, one of the hemispheres tends to be better at more holistic type of processing and more holistic type of attention. And so that's kind of another clue. Face processing, prosopagnosia, holistic processing, holistic attention, and their neural substrates could be another potential topic for number 1. Remember, for all these topics, you would be describing the topic from Gazzaniga's perspective, from McGilchrist's perspective, comparing and contrasting the two authors' perspectives, and then kind of deciding whether you think McGilchrist's perspective is convincing. And then finally, some potential option number 2 topics. So remember, for the idea is you find a claim, there's 2 citations, and you read the articles of those citations and decide whether they support the claim that was made with them in the Master's Emissary. So one claim, here's a quote: "The right prefrontal region is critically involved in self-recognition." And that's whether you're seeing your own face or hearing your own voice. And imaging studies of self-recognition confirm the role of the right hemisphere. There's 2 citations. Basically, this claim is about basically saying recognizing yourself uses the right hemisphere more than it uses the left. Here are the articles which supposedly provide support for that. You would read those and decide whether these articles do actually show that, whether they are convincing. Another claim, asomatognosia, the condition where people don't recognize some of their own parts of their body as belonging to themselves. It's found in 90% of people that have some type of right hemisphere stroke. And apparently, according to McGilchrist, all individuals that have asomatognosia have right hemisphere damage. In other words, all known instances of people with asomatognosia have at least some right hemisphere damage. There's no current research that McGilchrist at least talks about where it shows that people have asomatognosia after only left hemisphere damage. It seems to be a disorder which is caused primarily or only by right hemisphere damage. And here are the citations he provides in support for that. So that's it for this video. I will mention, though, there is the extra credit assignment, which about a third of the class turned in. An extra credit assignment, I mentioned it in the previous video. I'm not going to provide a new extra credit opportunity in this video, but for those individuals who have not turned in the original one, I will accept it. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go watch the Symmetry in the Brain video. I mentioned the extra credit opportunity at the end. If you already turned it in, you're good. But if you haven't turned it in, you can turn it in late, though I will take off at least 20%. I'm happy to talk more about this stuff on a Zoom meeting or over email. If you have questions, feel free to send them my way. See you guys tomorrow.